company policies haven't necessarily updated for like the rise of legalization of marijuana and the rise of use of marijuana. And what I mean by that is like, I'm not sure if this is in the company's policies, but like, you have a company corporate event and like they serve alcohol. Great. Like, can someone, consume marijuana before that event or during that event, right? Welcome to the Wellable Weekly Podcast, where we talk about key topics and trends at the intersection of well-being, technology, and HR. I'm Nick, along with my good friend Geoff. Geoff, nice little background you got there.
Yeah, I always say the same thing about you. So it's nice to kind of have my own greenery here, right in the Wellable HQ, right?
Exactly. As Geoff just alluded to, we normally record this podcast when we're in different locations, but Geoff is in Boston right now. We're both in the same office, but our podcast studio kind of setup isn't like really conducive for us both to like literally be in the same room, which is a shame, something we need to change. And so he's like literally in another conference room. So hence why you have the same aesthetic. And speaking of kind of perks, which I would say our plant game at our Wellable offices is part of one of the perks. An interesting survey about Gen Z workers, so just surveying Gen Z employees, and they talked about like the things that kind of sustain them throughout the day or kind of preferences that they want. And this term micro joys came up, right? And so the article defined micro joys as small moments that make the workday more enjoyable, productive, and sustainable. And effectively, one of the main takeaways of the survey is that Gen Z operates through this kind of micro joy, or what I would call like break type culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's a refreshing headline. I feel like so much of what we talk about and what is on the minds of your average worker right now is productivity and efficiency and using new technologies to support those goals, which are inherently very worthwhile pursuits, and both at the organizational level and for individuals to be productive and to move initiatives forward. But I think naturally at the expense of such kind of tunnel vision approach to figuring out how to use AI and be more productive, you probably forget about some of the kind of classic tried and true methods for sustainable working, and taking breaks is absolutely part of that. And there's so much evidence out there that supports the power of breaks and the need for really everyone to refresh and reset. And lo and behold, leave it to Gen Z to kind of help us be reminded of that. And hopefully be more thoughtful about incorporating these types of breaks into our days.
Exactly. Gen Z is like, they always use this term like redefining the workplace is becoming an increasingly larger percentage of the total workforce. And I think this is a good way of how they're being really additive. I know they're very kind of that. The survey suggests that generation is very kind of break centric, and like the reality is like every generation should be, right? This is like a good thing across the board. It seems to be adopted by Gen Z, and hopefully they can influence the older generations to take it. To put some numbers behind like the dynamic here, and from the survey, all super high. 79% said taking short breaks make their workday more enjoyable. 75% said that breaks help them perform better work. 82% of respondents said that they are most likely to have their best ideas when they're not at their desk. So if you're an employer saying, well, yeah, of course, employees in Gen Z want to be away from their desk, like what is it in for me? And I think the argument is like a recharged employee, like a refreshed employee, is a better employee. And when you take a break, you're not like off for 2 hours, right? You're taking like these short kind of micro joys, as they coined it in the article, and they're short, they're restorative. They often lead to more work. So you get your best idea during your break and when you're away from your desk. It's kind of like working, I would say. And so there's real benefits to the employer, not just the employee, for doing this.
Yeah, and I feel like those things can coexist too, right? Hard work and productivity can certainly be in harmony with work joy in the workplace and taking time to reset, not only personally, but again, of course, time to enjoy moments with colleagues and things like that. You don't have the classic water cooler or coffee machine interactions like maybe you once did, but there's certainly new ways to wind down or kind of reset together. And I just think this whole concept of breaks is entering a new era, and certainly some of that is going to be driven by the generational workforces that are maybe leaning into it even more. But I mean, even in our own organization and product, right? We have a feature called Breaks. It's from a company, Bright Breaks, that we acquired late last year, that has just been so popular, not only with our own employees and staff, but also with the clients who have adopted it, because it really is that consistent, positive, healthy reminder of the importance of breaks and how it can be something that only takes a couple minutes out of your day, but can make such a big difference in your overall mental health and certainly your productivity if you're in a better headspace when you pick that project back up or go into that meeting in a more focused and positive way.
I remember talking to David, who's the CEO and founder of Bright Breaks, and you ask any founder, hey, what's your product do? And there's the literal definition of the product saying, oh, we deliver hundreds of live breaks throughout the day that people can join, from movement breaks, nutrition breaks, to games breaks, and all this type of stuff. And that's technically what they do. But in a bigger picture, I think it was kind of an off the cuff comment, but for me, it always really stuck. It's the product gives people permission to take a break. Now, we provide a lot of resources for people when they're unsure of what a good break is for them. Hey, a quick little stretch break, right? Kind of thing. And that's great because it provides something to kind of capture your attention while you quote break. But just by offering Bright Breaks and a company's telling their employees, this is a permission to recharge yourself, to restore yourself, to come back for the remainder of the day even better, right, than you were when you kind of where you were before the break. And I think that's a really important dynamic, that sometimes the product itself is the permission people need. And in a culture where Gen Z is really latching on to micro joys and things like that, and maybe the senior management teams in a generation that doesn't necessarily appreciate that, it goes a long way by just giving that permission, not just to Gen Z, but to the entire employee base, to say, we value these things, we're giving you resources to do it, and it's a very explicit permission to go out and take that break.
Yeah, permission is the key word there. I think, again, there's a connotation with taking a break that has some employees, especially maybe in a tight labor market where they're hearing about reductions in force and things of that nature, where they might feel concerned about how they'd be perceived if they took a break. So to have the employer sponsored or employer encouraged version of a break just really frees up everyone to do things that are going to come naturally when they're feeling like they could use a little reset, but also just get that nudge, get that reminder. And again, for me, in a very calendar driven way of working, right? If it's not scheduled, maybe it's not getting done. So being able to have a little daily check-in or a little daily nudge to take that 5 or 7 minute break, even if you don't take it every day, right? But if it's there, it's going to remind you, kind of like how, of course, Apple Watch and other smart devices have the reminders to stand, right, or reminders to move. I think it's the same kind of thing, reminder to kind of reset and give yourself a little mental break.
Yeah, and just to put number, if you need another reason, obviously Geoff and Nick endorse the break concept, right? But if you need more reason to do it, at some point the company just needs to realize people are doing it anyways. So you either sanction it or you don't, but it doesn't change the outcome necessarily. If anything, it makes it worse for you not to kind of promote it or support it, and people do it, right? And so the survey also had a kind of a stat that I thought was interesting, that 77% of the Gen Z employees who responded to the survey said they already intentionally build small moments of enjoyment in their workday. So they're doing it anyway, you may as well just support it, because it just seems like you're fighting a current that you should never fight in the first place, but you're kind of going against the population in a way that doesn't seem super productive. The study also covered perks, right? And thinking about what do Gen Z want from perks. And they said the two top perks, which I always find interesting, are healthy snacks, right? Which is a very return to office thing. You're not getting healthy snacks at home, right? And to clarify, healthy snacks and beverages, right? And more time outdoors, which, for me, when I take breaks, I often take a walking break, sometimes on a treadmill desk, sometimes it is outdoors when the Boston weather is really nice. And so 43% for both categories, the snacks and more time outdoors, was the top perk. And just to provide context, people often, especially of older generations, think like PTO is like the top perk. And for Gen Z, PTO only ranked top for 24% of the people, right? So that's like a really big indication that the shift of like what Gen Z values is very different than maybe previous generations.
Yeah, it's also kind of a progressive mindset of work-life integration in a way, right? Of course, I'm sure Gen Z values PTO, but at the same time, they realize that they have a lifetime of work ahead of them. They're going to be spending, many hours of their, Monday through Friday at a workplace physically, or in some cases, in a hybrid environment. But in any case, being able to go to a place where they feel comfortable, where they have access to things that make them feel good, and can not be, inside maybe for that entire workday, and maybe have a place where they're working near a park or that has access to trail systems, or even just like a very walkable city, can deliver again a boost, or some moments of joy and energy, that can obviously go a long way. So a little bit of a transition to the other article that I know we wanted to cover is we just talked about so many ways of kind of revitalizing breaks and generally positive kind of activities and behaviors to lean into and endorse from an employer standpoint, and also from an individual perspective, things that I think are commonly accepted as being pretty good. A little bit more of a, I guess, controversial subject would be marijuana usage, right? And I think we just saw this headline that America has really hit a major milestone as daily marijuana or weed use surpasses daily drinking for the first time. And this has been a trend that's been in the making for several years now, right? I think really kind of in the early 2020s, that cannabis use ticked up pretty consistently, and we for the first time have more people again using marijuana daily than alcohol, and also cigarettes, right? There are some other pretty interesting stats in this article around how and when folks are using marijuana, and again, daily being, of course, kind of the key metric that they were looking at, but also found that more than 51% of respondents, Gen Z specifically, reported using THC during the workday, right? And that's the one that kind of stood out to me in terms of how does this kind of relate to the first topic that we covered, and certainly something that in a post-COVID era where remote and hybrid work is more common, although we're certainly seeing more and more RTO. I think 3 days in office is now the most common. There's still time when folks are going to have the ability, wherewithal to kind of enjoy recreational activities like this in the comfort of their home, or if they are going on a break and kind of looking for a reset. So just thought it was kind of an interesting parallel when we talk about how people reset and can do that through employer kind of sponsored, employer encouraged breaks, and also kind of how they're choosing to do that in their own time.
Yeah, this, like you kind of alluded to, this is a Gen Z story as well, right? Gen Z, I think, is in the article the only generation where the workers use THC or marijuana in excess of their alcohol consumption, right? And just as a general kind of global trend, if you look at all the stocks of like the liquor companies and the beer companies like that, they're all down because I think part of the story is GLP-1s and people are just consuming less alcohol in general at the older level because of some drugs and other things like that, like drugs being the pharmaceutical. But then the Gen Z cohort is just drinking less. Like they're just choosing to drink less, and when they are engaging in some type of like mind altering type substance, it tends to be marijuana or something else and not alcohol. So as that generation continues to become a bigger part of your workforce, you're just going to see that shift. And the thing I find like really interesting is twofold in the story. One, is something we talked about, I think maybe 6 or 7 podcasts ago. It was a long time, but it was about that study where, you know, people were finding ways to cope with mental health challenges differently. And one of those common ways was THC and marijuana, and that was most popular in the Gen Z cohort. It was popular throughout, right, or increasingly popular throughout every generation, but increasingly so, or kind of majority so, for that Gen Z cohort. And there's this modern health study that was also referenced in the article that I thought was interesting, that 63% of the workforce, this is everyone, not just Gen Z, engages in at least one form of self-medication after working, and 52% have self-medicated during the workday, which is kind of the point you're making. Now that goes beyond just marijuana use necessarily, but it's primarily THC and marijuana use. And so that's just an alarming stat for all employers. And for every employer to think like that doesn't happen within my 4 walls, these numbers are so high that you would truly, truly need to be an anomaly or this crazy exception to think that you don't have some material number of employees that fall into that bucket, right? And then what do you do about it? And I don't know if the answer is, right? Obviously, the one thing I would say is like, my guess in general sense is that company policies haven't necessarily updated for like the rise of legalization of marijuana and the rise of use of marijuana. And what I mean by that is like, I'm not sure if this is in the company's policies, but like, you have a company corporate event and like they serve alcohol. Great. Like, can someone, consume marijuana before that event or during that event, right? Is that okay? It's a social event. And I'm not really taking a side here, but a lot of policies and clarification probably need to happen, and a lot of realization of like how that's being used for employees and potentially during the workday that need to be like reconciled with or addressed by the employer at some point.
Yeah, you just think so much has to be kind of updated to account for things like this, right? I mean, I even think of certain like union agreements that have probably been around forever, where unionized workers are allowed to have a certain number of drinks on their work break or something like that. Well, like, can you? Are you supposed to expand that to have? Oh yeah, that's real for sure. Yeah, it's something that they have negotiated into union agreements for workers to be able to enjoy a legally responsible amount of alcohol on a break, right? And I wonder if the same thing would come up here in a future union discussion. But I mean, I think the question that also just comes up is like, how much of an issue is this, right? I mean, if you read this article and you listen to senior medical analysts saying that it reflects a very disturbing trend, right? And if you were to ask maybe your average Gen Z worker, is this an issue? I'm not sure, depending on who you ask, you might get a variety of answers. And I think that just goes to show how normalized marijuana use has become, maybe more so in different parts of the U.S. or again in different generations. But the one comment that stood out to me is how, because of that normalization, there is maybe less attention going into how a substance like this, just like alcohol, can impact mental performance, judgment, memory, all forms of impairment. Certainly are things that you need to be cognizant of and just going about your daily life, but also when you're going about your work, right? I think you'd be hard pressed to make a case that advocating or supporting marijuana use during the workday for an employer wouldn't potentially have negative ramifications on somebody's ability to do their job. So it's likely happening, and you can see here, again, more than half of the survey participants indicated that they're using marijuana during the workday. So it's kind of happening in the shadows, and employers don't really have any kind of probably real understanding of what the impact, positively or negatively, that's having on folks' ability to do their job, but I guess also be able to kind of have a sustainable kind of working arrangement, like we talked about earlier, as it relates. Maybe it's a form of break for some people.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one thing I would say is like double click on the shadow thing. You often hear this about tobacco use, right? Tobacco use has gone down substantially, but vaping has gone up substantially. And vaping allows you to have that experience in the shadows. And what I mean by that is like, you can like people do at their desk at home, right? Like they have to like go outside to smoke a cigarette, but you can like hop off Zoom or between things. Like it's much easier to consume a vape. It's a pen, it sits in your pocket, right? Things like that. And so people, you talk to HR folks and you talk about tobacco cessations, right? Oh, we don't really have people who smoke that much in our company. And like that may be true in the traditional sense, but the reality is like you don't really know that. Like statistically, it's probably higher than you think it is, depending on the type of workforce you have. But you don't really have an idea. And the reality is we all can agree that it happens in the shadow. I think the same thing happens with marijuana, right? Like there's edibles, there's different ways to consume it in a way that it is, I'm guessing, it is pretty hard to drink on the job and people not know. You smell like it, there's a bottle, there's all this things that can signal that someone's been drinking, right? And short of like real impairment, someone could like be like using small doses of like edibles or something like that, and that could like get them through the day. And then one thing I will say that's also different from alcohol, whether it's like fair or not, just like the reality of like the perception in the market is the legalization of marijuana happened as a medication, not as a recreational use. Now, in states like Massachusetts, where we are right now, you have it for recreational use, and that's becoming more and more popular throughout the United States, but more states than not don't have it for recreational use. And so the reality is that where someone says you're impaired, no one thinks like, oh, you should use alcohol to solve whatever ailment you have. No one ever says that. That's never a doctor recommended option.
Right.
But there are people who say, oh, you should do like microdosing to reduce your anxiety. Like that is something that people use. And some employers could get around another drug that's not marijuana that reduces an employee's anxiety as a tool to help them perform better, right? Or a tool to make them feel better, right? And so I think there's a debate that just doesn't happen with marijuana, or at least I don't see it. If the debate's happening, it's happening in the shadows. I talked to a ton of HR folks, I talked to a ton of brokers, and this topic never comes up. I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago, we were blogging about this topic, and it just didn't seem like all that popular because people weren't thinking about it. But when I hear myself talk about it, I go, this is a topic that really needs to be addressed. Like, is there some acceptable use of marijuana during the workday? Is it only medical? I'm assuming it has to be only medical, not recreational. Is that acceptable to not? Should be disclosed, right? I don't think companies at large are talking about it.
I don't think they want to tackle it. I think they're maybe just content to kind of let it happen in the shadows, but maybe it's because it's a really difficult difficult problem to solve or difficult policy to establish, and there's so many different kind of nuances to it that it may just be kind of easier to let it play out, and they're clearly not noticing too many direct repercussions from letting it go without a structured policy around it. But it's just obviously an interesting phenomenon that it's such a real and significant part of the workday for so many people.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to wrap up for today. Thanks as always for those who tune in. You can always get your Wellable Weekly podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, again, wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to tune in to Wellable Weekly newsletter for all the latest insights there. Thank you.